Trade is the lifeblood of nations. This has been a principle that has guided the international arena since it became possible for us to travel the globe. And it was access to the seas that brought the distant economies of the world closer together. This is especially true today. Trade is still the lifeblood of nations, which makes the South China Sea the world's jugular. According to the New York Times of September 20th, 2018, nearly a third of all the world's trade flows through the South China Sea, making it incredibly important to the world's economy. And China wants all of it. In clear defiance of international law, the Chinese government has laid claim to nearly 80% of the South China Sea. How? Well, in a nutshell, they're building islands, slapping a military base on it, and declaring the whole thing to be sovereign Chinese territory. China is more than capable of bullying its neighbors into accepting this, but there's one power player in the region who may be less deterred: the United States. According to The Economist of October 4th, 2018, a U.S. naval cruiser came within 50 meters, or half the length of a football field, from colliding with a Chinese warship conducting maneuvers in what the rest of the world considers to be international waters. The stage seems set for a showdown between two powerful countries over the world's most valuable waterways. So by exploring the history of the South China Sea, assessing the crisis as it stands today, and discovering implications, we set a course for what Newsweek of August 18th, 2018 calls the one thing capable of stopping Chinese conquest of the South China Sea: war. China's relationship to the South China Sea goes back a millennia, longer than before European powers even discovered America. Their claims to the place is rooted in this history. So any discussion of the issue that leaves this out is missing the bigger picture. China believes it is recovering what has always belonged to it. According to the Center for Ocean Law and Policy's 1988 publication, Security Flashpoints, China has imposed its will on the South China Sea since the Jin Dynasty. In the year 265 AD. China enjoyed an uncontested rule over much of East Asia, taxing, fishing, and administering laws all throughout the South China Sea. To this day, Chinese artifacts dating back a millennia can be found scattered across the islands in the South China Sea. The BBC of October 6, 2018 argues that this is the real basis of China's claim. That the South China Sea is not just a part of China's sphere of influence, but that it is as much a part of China itself as Beijing. So what happened? The 19th century was not particularly kind to China. The Chinese empire suffered blow after blow from European powers seeking to exploit its territory and resources, faced a growing rival in a rapidly modernizing Japan, and lost domestic control over much of its own territory. The South China Sea was just the first bit to begin to slip out of its grasp. European powers discovered the islands, planted their own flags, and administered their own laws, all while a powerless Chinese government watched helplessly. This forms the bulk of what the Chinese government calls the Century of Humiliation. According to the Economic Times of August 6, 2018, this essentially traumatized Chinese political culture, and the desire to undo the territorial loss and shame underpins Chinese foreign policy to this day, in and out of the South China Sea. Unfortunately for China, recovering the territory it lost in the modern day will be much trickier than it was for European powers, because of two new kids on the block: international law and the United States of America. First, China has to contend with this newfangled thing called international law, namely Article 5 of the United Nations Convention on Law of the Sea. Vox Atlas of February 17, 2018 explains, the article designates an area 200 miles off the coast of a country as that country's exclusive economic zone, or EEZ, meaning it and it alone determines what kind of activity takes place in those waters. China has signed this treaty, but also has its own idea about how the South China Sea should be divided up. Enter the 9-dash line, a notorious map published by the Chinese government illustrating their claims to the region. Not only is this a clear violation of international law, but it also brings China into conflict with Brunei, Malaysia, Taiwan, the Philippines, Indonesia, and Vietnam. This is where the fake islands come into play. 7 of them, none of which existed as recent as 5 years ago. They bolster China's own claims to the region and make it harder for other countries to access their own territory. Next, the ACN reporter on August 18, 2018, reports on China's tactics in this area, what's commonly referred to as the cabbage strategy. Essentially, when another country attempts to access its own EEZ, China bullies them out of it by surrounding the island or resource with overlapping patrols of ships that fold in on each other much like a cabbage, and scares off China's opponents. They go even further, laying siege to islands, intercepting shipments of food and water until the supposed trespassers vacate the territory altogether. And when that doesn't work, they're not afraid to threaten war. Forbes of August 6, 2018 reports that when the Philippine government enjoyed the benefit of a UN tribunal ruling in its favor over the ownership of a disputed island, the Chinese government told the Philippine government that if they set foot on that island, there would be war. The Chinese government enjoys uncontested domination over the South China Sea except for one player, the United States. And these two superpowers are waging a brutal stalemate game of chess over the world's most valuable waterways. It's this reality that gives rise to 2 implications: Chinese imperialism and the Thucydides trap. First, the Chinese practice of reverting back to ancient Chinese history as basis for territorial claims is nothing new. According to Bloomberg on October 3, 2018, it's standard practice for the Chinese government to refer to the territory of an ancient Chinese empire to justify modern-day land claims, ranging everywhere from India to Russia to the South China Sea. So it's perhaps ironic that the tactics employed by the Chinese government today, economic warfare, destabilization, and overt threats of war, so clearly mimic the imperialist tactics once used against it. China is attempting to right the wrongs of its imperialized past, but in doing so, it becomes an imperialist itself, flouting international law and bullying its neighbors, all of whom have suffered at the hands of empire alongside China in the not-so-recent past. Lastly, the conflict between China and the United States appears to be playing out a pattern called Thucydides' trap, named for a Greek historian who first noted the pattern occurring between Athens and Sparta. Essentially, the Asian Times of September 18, 2018 describes, the pattern is that when a rising power attempts to transition into a global power, they always run into conflict with the established power. In this scenario, China is the rising power, and the United States plays the role of the established power. Neither side is willing to back down. To maintain its global hegemony, the United States must retain command of the seas. It's foundational in American foreign policy. But for China to obtain its imagined destiny as a global power alongside the United States, it must wrest control of its neighboring seas. These 2 goals are intractable. If neither side is willing to abandon their ambitions over the South China Sea, according to Thucydides' trap, war is inevitable. Today, we examined the South China Sea crisis. Though China has a historical stake in the game, its ability to recover its lost territory is running up against our modern notion of maritime law. China is engaged in a deadly battle with the United States over the most valuable waterways in the world. And unless either side is capable of revising their imperialist ambitions, it seems that a war potentially too costly for either side to bear, is all but inevitable.